So I'm usually not the type to write stuff like this, but this just happened last week and I can't stop thinking about it. I was the designated driver that night and looking back, I think I might have saved our lives. Here's what happened. Last Friday, my friend Josh started talking about this girl he'd met in one of his classes. He'd been talking to her for a few weeks and he said she was pretty into him. Her name was Alyssa, and apparently she was a bit older, like 25 or something. Josh had just turned 21, so he was stoked about it. Anyway, Alyssa invited him to this party at her friend's place out in the woods. He asked if he could bring a couple of friends, and she was totally cool with it, so Josh invited me and our other friend, Ben. Honestly, the whole thing seemed a little weird to me. I mean, a party out in the middle of nowhere with people we didn't know. But Josh seemed pretty hyped, and Ben was all about it too, so I figured why not. Besides, Josh didn't have a car, and Ben's was in the shop, so they needed a ride. We left around 8 PM, and after about 45 minutes of driving, we finally turned off the main road onto this gravel driveway that led way into the forest. No houses around, no lights, just trees and shadows. By then, I was getting a little bit uncomfortable, but Josh kept reassuring us that Alyssa was cool and her friends were chill. I just shrugged it off, figuring I'd hang out for a bit, stay sober since I was driving, and make sure the guys didn't do anything too stupid. When we finally pulled up, the house looked massive. It was one of those modern ones, all sharp angles and huge glass windows, with a bunch of lights inside. But there were hardly any cars outside. Just 2 cars and a jeep, which seemed kind of odd for a party. I even mentioned it, but Josh waved it off, saying maybe people were carpooling or something. Ben joked about it being a rich people party and how they probably just Ubered or whatever. We got out, and Alyssa came to the door with 2 other girls, Hannah and Liv. They were all dressed up, maybe a little too dressed up for a random house party. Alyssa hugged Josh, like they'd known each other for years, and then she introduced the 3 of us to her friends. Hannah was tall with long black hair, and Liv was smaller, with blonde hair in a messy bun. Both of them smiled and hugged Ben and me, which felt kind of weird. They were just super touchy right off the bat. Inside, the place looked even bigger. The main floor was all open, with high ceilings and fancy furniture. But again, there were hardly any people. Just a few guys who looked about our age, sitting on the couches and talking quietly, and one other guy in his 40s or 50s who seemed to be chatting with everyone. He gave us this nod when we walked in, like he'd been expecting us. After a few minutes, Alice and her friends handed Josh and Ben some drinks. They offered me one too, but I reminded them that I was driving. Alyssa just shrugged and said, "Suit yourself," then took Josh's arm and led him into another room to introduce him to a few people. Liv and Hannah stayed with Ben and me, chatting and laughing about random stuff, but every time I looked away, I'd catch them glancing at each other in this weird way, like they were in on some kind of joke I didn't get. About half an hour in, Josh came back looking a little out of it. He'd only had 2 drinks, but he was acting like he'd have 5. His face was kind of flushed, and he kept touching his neck like he was uncomfortable. I asked him if he was okay, but he just laughed it off, saying the drink Alyssa gave him was stronger than he thought. We kept hanging out, and after a bit, Hannah took Ben to see the view from the upstairs balcony. I started feeling even weirder about this whole setup, but I figured maybe they were just hitting on my friends. I mean, Josh and Ben were both single, and maybe this was just how they partied out here. I was still keeping an eye on things though. Alyssa drifted back to where I was and offered me a soda instead of a drink. She kept insisting I at least have something, but I declined. I was starting to feel really uneasy, especially when I noticed that Josh had this little red mark on his neck, like a scratch or something. When I asked him about it, he just brushed it off, saying maybe he'd bumped into something. But there was something in his eyes, like he didn't quite know what had happened either. Ben came back down after a while, looking a little spaced out too. He had a similar red mark on his neck. I pointed it out and he shrugged, mumbling something about bumping into a tree outside. I laughed it off with him, but I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. Things got weirder from there. The 3 girls started whispering to each other and glancing at us, like they were sizing us up. The other people at the party were just kind of sitting around, talking quietly or watching us with these odd smiles. And that older guy I noticed when we came in. He kept moving around the rooms, stopping every so often to look at each of us, like he was checking in on something. By now, Josh and Ben were looking seriously out of it, and I was starting to get scared. I knew they hadn't had enough to be this drunk, not in the time we'd been here. I asked Ben if he wanted to head out, but he just waved me off, saying he was fine. I tried Josh next, but he seemed just as out of it, looking at random things and barely making sense when he talked. Eventually, I excused myself to use the bathroom, hoping to find a quiet place to think things through. I made my way down a hallway, and that's when I saw a door at the end that was slightly open. I peeked in, thinking maybe it was a guest room or something, but it looked like a staircase leading down the basement. I know it sounds stupid, but something was pulling me to go down there. I crept down the stairs, trying to be quiet. The basement was dark, but I could make out a few lights in the distance, coming from what looked like a second room. As I got closer, I started hearing these soft voices, almost like chanting. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I moved closer, peeking into the room. Inside, I saw a table covered with weird stuff, jars with herbs that looked like medical supplies, and a few notebooks filled with scribbled writing. There were also some small trays, and on one of them, I saw little vials with a clear liquid. I couldn't say for sure, but I had a horrible feeling that whatever was in those vials was what they had slipped into my friend's drinks. I backed up, trying not to make a sound. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard footsteps above me, and I knew I didn't have much time. I bolted up the stairs, trying to keep my cool, and went straight to find Josh and Ben. They were both leaning against the wall, barely able to stand. I didn't even hesitate. I told them we had to go right now. Ben mumbled something, but I wasn't listening. I grabbed him and practically dragged him to the front door, with Josh stumbling along with us. Alyssa and the other girls were suddenly right there, asking why we were leaving, telling us to relax and stay a little longer. But I pushed past them, practically carrying my friends out to the car. Once we got in, I locked the doors and started the engine. The girls came outside, standing on the porch with these blank expressions, just watching us. I drove down that driveway so fast, I'm surprised I didn't wreck the car. The guys were out cold within minutes, and I didn't know what to do, so I just drove straight to the hospital. The doctors said they'd been drugged, but they wouldn't tell me with what. They both ended up being fine, thank God, but neither of them remembered much about the night. They both had those red marks on their necks for a few days though, like someone had pressed something sharp against their skin. Looking back, I don't know what those people wanted, or what they were planning to do if we'd stayed, but I'm just grateful I got us out when I did. So yeah, this happened last weekend, and I still can't really believe it. It was probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had, and I still can't make any sense of it. I feel lucky to have gotten out of there, honestly. I guess I'll just start at the beginning, even though part of me feels like this whole thing was a bad dream or something. So I matched with this girl, Emily, on Tinder about 2 weeks ago. She seemed pretty cool, maybe a little out of my league, but we got to talking and she actually suggested we meet up. She said she'd invite me to this exclusive party at her friend's place in a nicer suburb outside of town. It seemed a little weird, like who invites someone to a party on the first date, but whatever, I was down. I figured why not. When I showed up, I could already tell something was off. First, the neighborhood was dead silent. It was around 9 p.m, but no lights on in any of the houses except this one big, modern-looking place where the party was supposedly happening. Emily had given me an address, but she had been weirdly vague about details, like not telling me whose house it was or who'd be there. Just, oh, you'll have a great time, I promise. I walked up the driveway and there were no cars outside. That struck me as a bit strange. I mean, if this was some kind of exclusive party, wouldn't there be more people? I almost turned around then, but right as I started to hesitate, the door swung open and there she was, Emily, waving me in with this big smile. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed how quiet it was. There were maybe a dozen people there, all kind of standing around in small groups, talking in these low voices. It didn't look like any party I'd ever been to. No music, no laughter, just this soft, almost nervous chatter. Everyone was dressed really nicely too, expensive looking suits and dresses that made me feel undressed in my jeans and the bottom up. I tried to joke about it with Emily, but she just smiled and said, "Oh, you look perfect, just follow my lead." She led me into the living room, and this is where things started to get even weirder. The people there looked, well, they all looked like they were in their 40s or 50s, maybe even older. I don't know, just wealthy and a little put together, you know. It's like they didn't belong at a party like this. They'd glance at me now and then, giving me this polite but distant smile that didn't reach their eyes. Emily introduced me to a couple of them, but the conversations felt so awkward. Every time I tried to make small talk, they just kind of give me these vague answers or look at each other with these odd, knowing smiles. At one point, I asked the guy who was probably in his 50s, and he just chuckled and said, "Oh, we all go way back." I figured maybe they were old college friends or something, but it didn't feel like that, if that makes sense. There were just this tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. After a bit, Emily took me in another room where there were fewer people. It was set up almost like a lounge area, with dark leather couches and dim lighting. She got us drinks, these fancy cocktails that I'd never heard of, and sat down really close to me. I tried to get her to tell me more about the party, but she kept changing the subject, asking me about myself or telling me how excited she was that I'd come. She kept touching my arm too, which I guess would have been fine, except I could see the people in the other room glancing over, watching us, like they were sizing me up or something. After about half an hour, things started to feel really uncomfortable. A couple of the guests came over and introduced themselves, but their questions were all odd. They'd ask me where I grew up, what my family was like, if I'd ever done anything extreme. I laughed it off at first, thinking they were trying to be funny, but they kept pressing. And when I didn't answer how they seemed to want, they'd give each other these weird looks, like I failed some test. Finally, Emily suggested we check out the upstairs. I was getting more and more uncomfortable, but I figured maybe if I just played along, things would make more sense. So we went up this wide staircase, and she led me to the room at the end of the hall. Inside, there was a big table set up with what looked like name tags, each one neatly arranged in rows. I was like, "What's this?" And Emily just laughed, telling me it was for later. I noticed there were little objects next to each name tag: keys, watches, jewelry, small personal items. It was strange, almost ritualistic. My name wasn't on the table, and when I asked Emily about it, she said, "Oh, don't worry about that, you're my guest tonight." She led me back downstairs, but I noticed her whole vibe had changed. She wasn't as friendly anymore, almost like she was trying to rush me along. Back in the main room, people were starting to gather around, all facing at the same direction, like they were waiting for someone to speak. I noticed a couple people kind of gesturing towards me, whispering and nodding. That's when I started to freak out a bit. I mean, the whole thing felt like some kind of setup, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on here, I wasn't supposed to be a part of it. I told Emily I needed to use the bathroom, hoping I could maybe slip out quietly after, but she insisted on showing me where it was. She led me down this hallway, but as we passed the kitchen, I noticed the back door. I made some excuse about wanting a glass of water and walked into the kitchen. Once I was alone, I texted my friend asking him to call me in like 2 minutes with some kind of emergency excuse. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I went back out to the main room, phone in hand, waiting for his call. When it came, I faked this panicked expression and told Emily I had to leave because of a family emergency. She just stared at me, and I swear there was this hint of annoyance in her eyes, like I was ruining something for her. She didn't argue though. She just gave me this tight smile and said, "Alright, I'll walk you out." We walked to the front door, and I felt like everyone was watching me as I left. As soon as I was out, I booked it to my car and drove off without looking back. Later that night, Emily texted me saying she hoped I had a good time and that she'd love to see me again. I didn't respond. I have no idea what I almost got wrapped up in, but I'm glad I trusted my gut. Something was seriously wrong in that house, and I don't even want to think about what might have happened if I'd stayed.